Thomas had spent 3 years looking down on Rose. Not in a cruel way, not intentionally, but in the quiet, automatic way that wealthy people sometimes look at those who serve them, with a kind of comfortable blindness that mistakes a uniform for a life story. Rose cleaned his house. Rose cooked his meals. Rose kept everything in his world running smoothly and asked for nothing beyond her salary at the end of each month. Thomas knew her name. He knew she was good at her work. He knew she was always there when he needed something, and always invisible when he did not. He thought he knew everything about her. He was wrong. On a Tuesday morning in March, Thomas found a document he was never meant to see. And in the space of 10 minutes, everything he believed about himself, about Rose, and about the 3 years they had spent in the same house was turned completely upside down. The man who thought he had everything realized he had been looking down on someone who had far more. This is that story. Thomas was 52 years old, and he had built his fortune the way most self-made men do, slowly, painfully, and with a great deal of pride. He had grown up in a modest home. His parents were good people who worked hard and asked little of life. Thomas had watched them work themselves tired for years and had made a quiet promise to himself he would do better. He would build something that lasted. He would become a man that people respected. And he had done exactly that. By the time he was 50, Thomas owned 3 businesses, a large, beautiful home on the edge of the city, and a reputation that preceded him into every room he entered. People returned his calls on the first ring. Restaurants reserved his preferred table without being asked. When Thomas spoke in meetings, people wrote down what he said. He was not arrogant. At least, he did not think of himself that way. He was simply a man who knew his worth. A man who had earned everything he had and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. His one weakness, the thing he rarely admitted even to himself, was that he measured people. Not consciously, not cruelly, but automatically, the way you calculate a bill before the receipt arrives. He looked at people and assessed them, their clothes, their speech, their posture, their position. He placed them quietly in a rank in his mind and treated them accordingly. It was a habit he had carried for so long that he no longer noticed it. Rose had arrived at his house 3 years ago with a quiet knock at the back door and a letter of recommendation from a woman Thomas had never met. She was composed and neatly dressed and spoke with a calm precision that he found reassuring. She was clearly competent. She was clearly trustworthy. She was, in Thomas's quiet assessment, exactly what she appeared to be, a maid. And so that was how he had treated her for 3 years. Respectfully, fairly, but always, always from a distance, from a height. He had no idea what was coming. Rose was 48 years old. She had worked in Thomas's house for 3 years, and in that time she had learned everything about him. She knew he took his coffee strong and his evenings quiet. She knew he was softer than he appeared and lonelier than he admitted. She knew that the confidence he wore in public cost him something in private, that behind the firm handshakes and the sharp suits, there was a man who still sometimes doubted himself in the dark. She had never told him any of this. It was not her place. What Thomas did not know about Rose, what no one in his world knew, was that Rose had not always been a maid. She had been born into one of the wealthiest families in the country. Her father had built an empire that spanned 4 industries and 2 continents. Her mother had been a woman of such grace and intelligence that people still spoke of her in certain circles with something close to reverence. Rose had grown up in houses that made Thomas's look modest. She had been educated at the finest schools. She had sat at tables with presidents and ambassadors and had spoken 5 languages before she was 25. And then, at 38, she had walked away from all of it. Not because she had to, not because something had gone wrong, but because she had looked at her life, the dinners and the titles and the beautiful emptiness of it all, and she had felt nothing. She had wanted to know what it meant to be useful, truly useful, to wake up each morning and do something with her hands that mattered to another person, to live without the weight of wealth pressing down on every moment. So she had placed her inheritance in the care of her family's trustees, taken a small monthly allowance, still more than most people earned, but a fraction of what she was worth, and she had gone quietly into the world as simply Rose. No title. No family name. No history. Just Rose. She had been at peace with that choice for 10 years. Until the Tuesday morning, when Thomas found the document. It began, as many life-changing moments do, with something completely ordinary. Thomas had asked Rose to collect some papers from his study and bring them to him in the sitting room. He was expecting a set of business contracts that his lawyer had sent over the previous day. Rose went to the study. She found the envelope on the desk. She picked it up and carried it to Thomas, without looking inside. Thomas opened it at the sitting room table. He pulled out the papers and began to read. And then he went very still. These were not his business contracts. These were financial documents. Trust documents. The kind that listed assets and holdings and valuations in long, careful columns. They had arrived at his address by mistake, a clerical error at a law firm that had confused two clients with similar addresses. Thomas would have set them aside and called the firm immediately, except that one word stopped him. A name. Rose. He read on. Slowly. Then again. Then a third time. Because his mind refused to accept what his eyes were showing him. The documents detailed a trust fund, an enormous one. The kind of wealth that Thomas, who was himself a wealthy man, had only read about in newspapers. Properties across 4 countries. Investment portfolios that generated more in a single month than most people earned in a decade. A family name that Thomas recognized immediately, one of the great dynasties of the country, old money and enormous influence. And the beneficiary of all of it, the woman whose name appeared at the top of every page, whose signature was required for every transaction, whose wealth was described in figures that Thomas read twice because he could not believe them the first time, was his maid. Thomas sat in his sitting room for a long time after that. He heard Rose moving in the kitchen. The familiar sounds of her working water running, quiet footsteps, the soft sound of cupboard doors opening and closing. Sounds he had heard every day for 3 years and never once truly listened to. He thought about the way he spoke to her, the slight distance he always maintained, the automatic assumption that he was the significant one in the room and she was the background. He thought about the birthday last year when his business partners had sent expensive gifts and Rose had left a small pot of homemade soup outside his study door with a note that said, "Simply feel better soon." He had thanked her briefly and thought nothing more of it. He thought about the evening 3 months ago when he had complained loudly on the phone to a colleague about a failed investment, talking freely, carelessly, as people do when they believe no one important is listening. Rose had been in the next room. He had not lowered his voice. He thought about all the small moments he had never noticed because he had already decided who Rose was before she had a chance to show him. A maid. That was all. And she had let him believe it. For 3 years. She had come to his home every day and worked quietly and competently and had never once, not by a word, not by a gesture, not by a single moment of impatience, suggested that she was anything other than exactly what she appeared to be. Thomas put the documents on the table. He stared at the ceiling for a while. Then he stood up and walked to the kitchen. Rose was at the kitchen counter when Thomas appeared in the doorway. She looked up. She saw his face. And, in the way that people who are very observant sometimes do, she understood immediately that something had changed. She set down what she was holding. Thomas placed the documents on the kitchen counter between them. He did not say anything for a moment. He looked at her. She looked at the documents. Then she looked back at him. He said, "These came in the envelope from my lawyer's office. I think they were sent to the wrong address." Rose said, "Yes, I imagine they were." She said it calmly, quietly, without any of the panic or shame that Thomas had half expected. Thomas said, "Rose, is this you?" Rose looked at the documents again. Then she looked at Thomas. She said, "Yes." One word, completely steady. Thomas pulled out a chair and sat down at the kitchen table. He needed to sit down. He said, "How long?" Rose said, "I have always had it. I was born into it." Thomas said, "And you chose to work here, in my house, cleaning my floors." Rose said, "Yes." He said, "Why?" Rose was quiet for a moment. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. This, too, was new. She had never sat at his kitchen table before. She had always stood. She said, "Because I needed to be somewhere real, to do something that mattered with my hands, to live a life that was mine, and not just the life that was handed to me." She paused. She said, "Your home needed someone to take care of it. You needed someone steady. I needed somewhere to be useful. It suited both of us." Thomas looked at her for a long time. He said, "You could have told me." Rose said, "You never asked who I was, Thomas. You asked if I could clean and cook and keep the house. I could. That was enough for you." The words were not cruel. They were simply true, and Thomas knew it. They sat at the kitchen table for a long time that morning. Thomas asked questions, and Rose answered them. Not all of them, not the ones that were too private, but enough. She told him about her family, about the life she had left behind, about what she had been looking for when she came to his door 3 years ago. She told him about the first year, when she had found the work harder than she expected, not physically, but emotionally. The adjustment of being invisible, of being looked through, of being present in a room but not seen. She told him she had almost left twice. Once, in the first month, when Thomas had corrected her in front of a guest in a way that was not unkind but was careless. And once, at the end of the first year, when she had overheard him describe her to someone on the phone as just the maid. Thomas winced at that. He said, "I am sorry." Rose said, "I know. That is why I stayed." He looked at her. She said, "Because I could see that you were not a bad man. You were simply a man who had never been asked to look properly. Most people are like that. They see the surface, and they stop. I have spent my whole life being the surface that people stop at." She looked at the documents on the counter. She said, "Money does that. It makes you a surface. When I had it, people saw the wealth and stopped looking. When I came here without it, people saw the uniform and stopped looking. I have been invisible in both directions." She said it without bitterness, without anger, just with the quiet clarity of someone who had thought about something for a very long time. Thomas said, "And what did you want people to see?" Rose looked at him steadily. She said, "Just me. That was all. Just the person sitting in front of them." After Rose went back to work that afternoon, Thomas sat alone in his study for a long time. He was not a man given to self-examination. He had built his life on forward motion, on the next deal, the next target, the next achievement. Looking back or looking inward had always seemed like a luxury he could not afford. But that afternoon he sat and he looked. He thought about the conversations he had never had with Rose, the questions he had never asked. How many times had she stood in this house, this intelligent, experienced, remarkable woman, and he had handed her a list of tasks without once wondering about the person holding the list. He thought about his own pride, the careful architecture of superiority he had built around himself. How much of his life had he spent measuring other people against his own worth, and how often had he been wrong? He thought about his parents, good, modest, hard-working people whom he loved deeply, but had spent his adult life quietly trying to rise above. What would they think of the man he had become? Not the successful man, the other one, the one who looked through people. He sat with these thoughts for a long time. Then he got up, walked to the kitchen, and did something he had never done in 3 years. He made Rose a cup of tea. He carried it to where she was working and set it beside her without a word. Rose looked at the cup. Then she looked at him. Thomas said, "I do not know how to do this yet, but I am going to learn." Rose picked up the cup. She said, "That is a good start." A week passed. Things in the house were different, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the quiet ways that matter. Thomas began to say good morning when he came downstairs. He asked Rose about her day and waited for the answer. He stopped talking on the phone as though she were furniture. Small things, but Rose noticed every one of them. On the 8th day, Thomas came to find her after dinner. He said, "I have been thinking about what you said, about being invisible in both directions." Rose waited. He said, "I would like to know you. if that is something you are willing to allow. Not as my maid, not as the woman in those documents, just as the person sitting in front of me." Rose looked at him for a long moment. She said, "You understand that I am not going to change who I am. I am going to keep doing the work I do here. Not because I have to, but because I choose to, because it means something to me." Thomas said, "I understand that." She said, "And you understand that knowing more about me does not give you any authority over me that you did not have before." Thomas almost smiled. He said, "I understand that too." Rose nodded slowly. She said, "Then yes, I think I would like that." In the months that followed, the people in Thomas's world noticed a change in him. His business partners noticed that he listened more in meetings, that he asked questions he would have dismissed before, that he had developed a patience that had not been there previously. His housekeeper, the woman who came twice a week to help Rose with the larger cleaning, noticed that Thomas now greeted her by name and asked after her children. His driver noticed that Thomas no longer spent entire journeys on the phone ignoring him, but sometimes asked how he was and meant it. Nobody knew what had caused the change. Only Rose knew, and she said nothing, as was her way. One evening, several months after the morning of the documents, Thomas and Rose were sitting at the kitchen table after dinner, something that had become a quiet habit between them. Rose was reading. Thomas was reviewing some papers. The house was warm and still. Thomas looked up from his papers. He said, "Rose, can I ask you something?" She looked up from her book. He said, "In all the time you have been here, when I was thoughtless, when I was careless, when I was the man I was before, did you ever regret staying?" Rose considered the question seriously, the way she considered everything. Then she said, "No, because I could see who you were becoming, even before you could see it yourself." Thomas was quiet for a moment. He said, "How?" Rose said, "Because you were always kind to the people who could not give you anything. Your driver, the delivery man, the woman at the gate. You were different with them than you were with people you wanted to impress. And I have always believed that the way a person treats someone who cannot help them is the truest measure of their character." She looked back at her book. She said, "You were always going to become this man. You just needed someone to stay long enough to see it happen." We all have a way of looking at people and deciding who they are before they have had a chance to show us. We look at a uniform and we think we understand a life. We look at a title and we think we understand a person. We look at where someone stands in relation to us, above or below, wealthy or modest, powerful or quiet, and we let that position tell us everything we think we need to know. Thomas looked at Rose and saw a maid. He was looking at one of the most remarkable people he had ever met. The tragedy was not that he was wrong. The tragedy was that he stopped looking. There is someone in your life right now that you have stopped looking at properly. Someone whose surface you see every day without ever wondering about the depth beneath it. Someone who has more to offer than you have ever asked them to show you. Someone who is waiting patiently, quietly, without complaint, to be truly seen. Do not wait for a document to arrive in the wrong envelope. Look now. Ask now. Listen now. The most extraordinary people are often standing right in front of us. We just have to stop looking through them. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I have a question for you today, and I would love to hear your answer in the comments. Have you ever misjudged someone completely and then discovered they were nothing like what you assumed? What happened when the truth came out? Tell me your story. I read every single comment. If this story made you think about someone in your own life, please share it with them today. And if you are new to this channel, welcome. There is a new story for you every few days. Subscribe so you never miss one. Until next time, look carefully at the people around you. You may be surprised by what you have been missing.